Well, it's genuinely a pleasure to be here. Thanks so much, Petar and Nathan, for allowing me to stumble on, as the last man. But I'm just going to begin with two sort of framing passages from Beckett. The first is from a letter, a late letter to his friend Mary Adams, 1987, and he writes, "Dear Mary, thanks for yours of the 10th. We are still breathing. Bid us sigh on from day to day, and wish the soul away, as mother once said to her deranged maid Mary Foran, apropos of the afterlife, hell is here." And the second is from Wordsworth Hoe. It's very short. Better than nothing, so bettered for the worse. Short preface, maybe just to try to provide some bit of a schematic frame for where I'll be going. If the task of thinking is a matter of thinking the worse, an orientation that Beckett articulates with utmost precision, there is no better place to begin than with the libertine works of the Marquis de Sade. The Sadean libertine is not only an incarnation of the worst, its imaginary embodiment. He or she is born of a peculiar imperative that constrains the writer to imagine the worst. Desiring in accordance with this imperative, the Sadean libertine manages to twist everything, starting, of course, with the good. Everything but the instrument of mastery. And so it's from there that I'll manage the transition from Sade to Beckett. So the first part is on Sade, so bear with me, but the Beckett will be coming along. In the world of the Marquis de Sade's libertine fiction, hell loses the certainty of its otherworldly place and bleeds into the fabric of the present. Hell is here. The Sadean libertine is the figure who says, like hell it is. If hell is here, then it is no longer a question of the hereafter, but the here and now. This life is like hell because it is the worst of places. Hell names the worst, and the Sadean libertine ensures that there is nothing worse. This is true, of course, for those unfortunates consigned to the excruciating fate of serving the libertine's lethal tastes. Condemned to a life of utmost humiliation, with only hope of death as respite, the victims of libertinage are pinned in place by the annihilating violence of their libertine masters. Their suffering is the mere vehicle of libertine enjoyment. Reduced to an absolute nullity, as Delmonte puts it in Philosophy in the Boudoir, reduced to an absolute nullity in the equation of libertine desire, their presence within the story of libertinage elicits no empathic concern. Their complete self-abnegation is all that is required. 1,000 times more submissive than any slave should be. To quote 120 Days of Sodom, their lives are without significance, digits to be deleted, flies to be swatted, mere cogs in the orgiastic machine. The Duc de Blanges of 120 Days does not mince his words. Consider your situation, what you are, what we are, and let these reflections make you tremble. Here you are, far from France in the depths of an uninhabitable forest, beyond steep mountains, the passes through which were cut off as soon as you had traversed them. You are trapped within an impenetrable citadel. No one knows you are here. You have been taken from your friends, your families. You are already dead to the world, and it is only for our pleasures that you are breathing now. Trapped within the impenetrable citadel of libertinage, they are already dead and yet unable to die. Their lives are hellish. The victims of libertinage have no reason to fear the worst because their condition could not be worse. Yet, for the libertine, the worst could not be better. At ease in this parched environment, Sade's libertines have no reason to fear the worst because they are masters in the art of making the worse the better. Their hell is heavenly, making of earth a living hell, the libertine by binding another to its delight, to quote Blake's The Pebble and the Clod, by binding another to its delight, builds a hell in heaven's despite. One cannot imagine merrymaking reduced to a more grim business. The worse can only be better if the good is not good. Nobody has gone further than the Marquis de Sade in making the good the bad. The effort aims to exhaust. It seems, in fact, as Lacan suggests, quote, as if one cannot conceive of an atrocity that isn't to be found in Sade's catalogue. The assault on one's sensibility is of a kind that is literally stupefying. In other words, one loses one's bearings. Evil, this is not Lacan, evil, murder, rape, theft, torture, betrayal, triumph definitively, Marcel Henoff writes, quote, never before had the odious, the cynical, and the murderous been given free rein with full impunity, while the virtuous, the innocent, and the honest were declared the enemy. The genre of black humor may have been an exception, but only when it declared itself as that genre and consistently produced that genre's signs, as Thomas de Quincey did, for example, in On Murder, considered as one of the fine arts. Before Sade, this kind of thing had never been seen, nor has it been seen since. Sadean libertinage's assault on the good serves to dislodge the very belief in its goodness. As Eugenie in Philosophy in the Boudoir declares after a lesson from Dalmansey, oh my God, how your lessons excite me. I think I'd let myself be killed now rather than perform a good deed. Eugenie, like all of Sade's libertines, must learn that the good is not what it appears to be, for if the good is not good, then the bad is in fact the better. It is not the good but the bad that grants access to enjoyment. And Sade is using basically jouissance for the most part here. So better to be bad. This teaching is the source not only of the unmitigated horror of Sadean libertinage, but also the strange perversity, the oddness of its humor. As the Duke of Blanches insists, quote, to be truly happy in this world, a man had not just to give himself to every vice, but always to refuse himself a single virtue, and that it was not just a question of always doing evil, but also of never doing good. To make the good the bad, the libertine cannot simply make the bad the good. Evil is truly evil only if the act lacks the form of goodness. The act must be utterly and completely gratuitous, without reason, without measure, excessive. The infliction of pain and suffering must serve no purpose and be unjustifiable. Apathy, sang-froid, allows reason to assume an essential unreasonableness. Sang-froid becomes sans-froid, and actually, interestingly, Sade uses this pun from sang-froid to sans-froid, which is actually an allusion, I guess, to Rousseau. So Eugenie's lesson, as Madame de Saint-Ange ensures, has to be conducted not simply with sang-froid, but sans-froid, right? A coldness to sense, to meaning. Sade definitively breaks then with the vision of the Divine Comedy, Dante's. The hellishness of Dante's Inferno is made possible by its infinite distance from heaven. The hopelessness of the damned serves an allegorical function. However horrid their suffering, their misery is not without sense. The rigor of their allegorical inscription ensures that their place in hell means something. Exemplums of waywardness, they serve as signs that enable the reader to position their suffering within a correct perspective. We who journey along with the poet into hell, who read the sign, abandon all hope, he who enters here, do not lose hope because we are able to read the sign, to register the allegorical significance of the hopeless, and thus maintain a space of passage between the place that it marks, that is hell, and its sense. This space of meaning transports us into the story's spiritual sense, or the poems, allowing us to attend to the whole, the Inferno's place in the Divine Comedy. We are at the beginning, not at the end. We are in hell, but not confined by it. The meaning of hell's hopelessness is defined by its relation to heavenly hope. The allegory separates hell from the literality of its torment, enabling the reader to discern in the depths of suffering a spiritual significance. By fitting each punishment to the individual sinner's crime, the poet enables us to read the presence of divine intent in the very details of their torture. The strictness of the allegory ensures that the use of violence is purged of excess. We need not fear for God's goodness. He derives no joy from the damned's eternal torture. By punishing the sinner in accordance with this sin, evil receives a precise and appropriate determination in terms of its distance and deviation from the good. The poem as such demonstrates, through the rigor of its method, the allegorical method, God's infinite justice. The horror of hell is thus not without reason. God the Father, as the ground of the sign's significance, ensures its relation to beneficence. The poet is careful to determine the meaning of hell's otherworldly significance. Yet, when Sade's man from hell, it's a figure in 120 Days of Sodom, enters upon the scene, the hell that he figures with murderous passion cannot be made to mean. Hell assumes a literality because the cruelty is unmeasured, the meanness unmitigated. The excess of the horror shatters any effort to justify it or assign it a reason. The gratuity of the violence separates the action of the story from any possible sense. It serves no purpose. All that remains is the residue of enjoyment that the story itself exposes, strips bare, denudes, rather than explains. The presence of the libertine introduces an écart, sorry for my French pronunciation, but this is the term that Sade often uses basically for deviation or perversion. So it's a gap or an écart into the story's connective tissue whose sense cannot be assigned. For there is no measure that can make sense of the rupture of the gap of the hole that the man of hell introduces into the universe. Sade's depiction of libertinage exposes a flaw in the universe that cannot be corrected and that cannot be placed into proper perspective. The story itself appears as ontologically incorrect. If there is enjoyment to be had in the depths of such misery, then the horror is not altogether horrible. Sade's school of libertinage is erected to show us that hell is not wholly hellish and horror not completely horrible. For, quote, the inveterate and infamous scoundrels with no God other than their own lubricity, no laws other than their own depravity, no limit other than their own debauchery, things could not be better. Avowing this gap between horror and the horrible, the story, in refusing to correct the horror, that is, to punish it, also refuses to justify it, to make sense of it. So instead, we find justification after justification for the violence itself, right? For its own sake. The libertine fills the hole in the plot with their reason, with their discourse that grounds their art, the art of making the worse the better. So Sade's school of libertinage does not only place us on grim ground, it seeks the grounds of the grim, shifting from the narration of its fable, storytelling, and elaborating its principle, philosophy. The principle of libertine fiction lies in saying all, to dire. Saying all means that one must say what ought not to be said, a saying, in other words, that abolishes the ought implied in all speech. The articulation of this principle directs focus to a foundational exclusion. Nothing ought to be excluded in advance from the telling. And the Sadean storyteller, principle in hand, believes that everything can be said, that there is nothing that cannot be said. It is the space of fiction that makes possible the triumph of the negative. into a positive imaginary, we could say. So Sade's Juliet thus concludes with the eponymous hero's declaration, "Oh, my friends," cried Juliet, wild from joy, "will he be wrong, the author who someday writes the story of my life, if he titles it The Prosperities of Vice?" Her libertine companion, Noirseul, adds, "Come, good friends, let us all rejoice together. From all this I see nothing but happiness accruing to all save only virtue. But we would perhaps not dare say so were it a novel we were writing." And Juliet's response is altogether remarkable. "Why dread publishing it," said Juliet, "when the truth itself, and the truth alone, lays bare the secrets of nature? However mankind may tremble before those revelations, philosophy must never shrink from speaking out. La philosophie doit tout dire." A more direct translation is preferable to the one Austin Wainhouse proposes. Philosophy must say everything. Philosophy must say all. If the novel, as Noirseul suggests, is obligated not to say all, but to say only what ought to be said, shying away from the declaration that happiness is a horror, it is because the form of the novel must uphold a belief in the whole. It is an organon that must exclude the orgy. It can thus accommodate all manner of horror, so long as horror makes dramatic sense, never loses its narrative function, its meaning and direction. Excesses, les écarts, must be measured, placed, and punished, their deviations assessed, counted, and accounted for. The narrative must correct the bulges in perspective. The imaginary must be constrained by the plausible, by the possible, by what Aristotle in poetics terms the likely. Philosophy boldly enters the terrain of fiction by exploding the limits of the imaginable. There is nothing that cannot be said, nothing that cannot be imagined, no horror that cannot find its place within the representational system. There is no horror that cannot be told. Juliet reminds Noirseul, and thus the reader, that the novel cannot escape the truth. Yet the truth is no longer aligned with the likely or the plausible. The rupture that the Sadean tale of libertinage enacts divides the true from the false, real from the imaginary. If the Sadean novel is not a novel, according to Noirseul, it is because it does not conceal the divisions on which its form depends. It loses its raison d'etre, serving no moral or edifying purpose. Sade shifts the measure from the likely to the true, but the true itself becomes the effect of a rupture. Conforming to no rule that would constrain its movement, the libertine tale grounds itself in the autonomy of libertine desire. The art of the novel must be assessed in terms of the immanence of the desire driving it. Narrative undergoes, we could say, an anamorphic shift in perspective. This is the foundational crime of Sadean poetics. In his response to the critic Wilterek, who is responding actually to the publication of Crimes of Passion, Sade states this in no uncertain terms, unable to constrain the tongue in his cheek. So I quote Sade, "For the author of the book in question," and Sade is here referring to Wilterek's suggestion that he himself is the author of Justine. "For the author of the book in question seems to give vice power over virtue simply out of willfulness and libertinage, a despicable ploy which he in no way feels bound to use to create dramatic interest." The problem of the book in question, and of his libertine fiction more generally, is not simply a matter of giving vice power over virtue, which is to say inverting the relation between good and evil. Sade gives the inversion an additional twist. It must be done simply out of willfulness and libertinage, a despicable ploy. It must be done out of desire alone. As long as vice continues to serve the dramatic interest of a story, all is well. The form of the story itself, its relation to goodness as such, is not called into question. Vice can even be shown to triumph, according to Sade, if the story enables the reader to better grasp the importance of virtue. Virtue's foundational role is not perverted as long as evil can be identified in its difference from the good. The story establishes this difference when it grounds the possibility of an effective response. The response may be outrage, producing indignation, anger, tears, but these feelings themselves attest to the story's inscription of a moral principle, engendering what Aristotle in the Poetics terms love of humanity, to philanthropon. To take up Sade's formulation, in the prefatory dedication of Justine, the tear that forms in the eye of an empathetic reader confirms the story's moral purpose, its capacity to arouse concern for humanity. Humanity as a whole must be the matter of concern. The despicable ploy of the author in question, of course Sade, consists, however, and the question lies in destroying the foundational logic of the story. By unhinging vice from the end of the story, from its function of creating dramatic interest, he breaks the story's philanthropic aim. The story's effective basis is irreparably disturbed by the entry of the least sympathetic of creatures, the Sadean libertine. With the libertine, an ontologically incorrect subject bursts onto the scene. The libertine, then, is born of an imaginary imperative. The address to the reader in 120 Days of Sodom, or the School of Libertinage, by the headmaster, right, who's the narrator, lays out the imperative. So I'm going to read a passage from that novel. The time has come, friendly reader, for you to prepare your heart and mind for the most impure tale ever written since the world began. For no such book may be found among the ancients or moderns. Imagine, and here it's imagine-toi. So imagine that any decent pleasures or any prescribed by that beast you endlessly invoke without knowing and that you call nature, that any such pleasures, and here the word is jouissance, I say, shall be expressly excluded from this collection. And should you stumble across them by chance, par aventure, which is interesting, so it's by the story or by the adventure, but by chance, it shall only be in cases where they shall be accompanied by some crime or tainted by some infamy. No doubt many of the various excesses you shall see depicted shall displease you, we know, but there shall be others that inflame you to the point of spilling your cum. And here the French word is foutre. And that is all we demand. If we had not said everything, analyzed everything, how do you think we could have guessed what appeals to you? It is for you to take what you want and leave the rest. Someone else shall do the same, and little by little, everything shall have found its place. So the imperative address to an intimate, right, inscribes the reader within the fictional walls with the aim of soliciting the deviations, right, of his or her desire. Governed by an imperative to imagine the unimaginable, whose image is formed through the exclusion of all that falls under the banner of decency, and here the word is honnête, so, the tale to be imagined is the effect of methodological negation. The imagination is constrained to fill out what remains after the logical exclusion of the good. By exhausting the negative, the singularity of one's desire will find its place within the story. The story will be an account that contains an enumeration quite precise of 600 passions. Quantitatively different, but qualitatively monotonous, Sade embeds them within the order of the story, blending them into the storyteller's tales. This is the quote, "It would have been too monotonous to describe them otherwise, one by one, without introducing them into the body of a narrative." Desire's excess will be counted and thus accounted for in its unaccountability. The story of desire will then have been written, The ambition is for the reader to locate and name their desire. Art will become the equal of science and philosophy if and only if the imagination, methodologically stripped of prejudice, infinitely extends desire. By gathering them into a tale, an account, the reader will be reduced to nothing, right? To a good-for-nothing subject. Right? This is an allusion to Henoff. So comprehended in their entirety, the faintest sign of titillation, of excitement, of illicit jouissance serves to position the reader, the point external to the tale, within it. And so in Feutre, come, the spillage of come, is the evidence of the demonstration of its success, right? So yet the excluded can only be included in principle through the monstrosity of the imagination, right? And it's interesting is that the aim is to be exhaustive, right? Everyone will find their place exhaustively within the space of the fiction, which is not a fiction, but the truth of desire. So Sade's libertine fiction provides an exhaustive catalog of horrors, an encyclopedia of excesses, to borrow Henoff's oxymoronic formula, that exposes the integral monstrosity, this is Klosowski's term, of a subject whose pursuit of happiness, not to mention life and liberty, has been wholly unhinged. The formula is oxymoronic because excess is at odds with the encyclopedic presumption to totality and completeness. To exhaust the inexhaustible aptly characterizes his work's central impasse and lends drama to what it seeks to demonstrate. There is no unspeakable horror, nothing that cannot be said. Expression is absolute in its extension. Language is wholly adequate to its object, and the inexpressive attests simply to a failing of the imagination. The imagination's infinite extension and pliability, as pliable as a piece of wax, shows, however, or at least hopes to show, that there is no limit to horror, nothing inexpressible. It can keep up with reason. All that is required is the effort. The libertine's tireless desire makes him, and this is sort of a pun that Henoff uses, a stock Casanovite, right? So there's sort of a fusion of the Stakhanovite and Casanova. So nothing stands in the way of libertine desire. It is not the limitations of the body, but the soul that remains an impediment. If the soul causes you to stumble, libertine wisdom runs, then excise it. The one who dissects a living body through the course of its incisions excises the soul's ineffable substance. The capacity to be unmoved in the face of the writhing body, the libertine's much vaunted apathy, exhibits the soul's absence. Libertine action reduces the soul to silence. The screams of the unfortunate are hollow and attest only to the echo of the soul's absence. The horror show of modernity loses the lure of the ineffable, becoming an object of exorbitant fascination and infinite investment, an object about which one can speak endlessly precisely because there is no end to the horror. Believing in the power of fiction to demonstrate that there is nothing that cannot be said, the drive of the Sadean libertine to say everything without reserve leaves nothing left to say. Writing about torture leaves no space for being tortured by writing. Few writers have been less tortured. The Marquis may have filled his writing with torture and unheard of obscenity. His stories may be painfully tortuous, but wit is nowhere encumbered by the material of its expression. Nothing but the referent was heard in discourse. Effortless mastery is the goal, and all is a matter of execution. Language remains for him, as Henoff writes, an evidentiary medium of the spoken, a dense veil of transparency. Sade, of course, makes transgressive use of language, overwhelming it with words and statements it was designed to exclude, mixing classical French with an indefatigable obscenity, constituted a violent assault on the norms of belles lettres, and Sade's open collusion with vulgar forms of speech that ought not to have been speaking threatened its social hierarchies. But as Henoff carefully stresses, never for a moment, and I'm quoting him, was this a matter of calling the structure of language into question, because the structure of language went unseen. The conditions that make writing possible, language and its body, the materiality of the signifier, did not serve to interrupt its imaginative trajectory. Writing is purely a matter of execution, and language a means to enjoyment. The sole aim and study of the school of libertinage, and this is citing Juliet, is to extend, to aggravate your sensations. One who has vanquished every obstacle as you have done and freed herself from every restraint must perforce go far. Only the most stimulating and gravest excess, the most odious, the most contrary to every law human and divine is now capable of igniting your imagination. Abolishing all external constraint, the only obstacle the libertine faces is reality itself. The bane of the libertine's existence consists in the fact that desire exceeds the means at their disposal, and it is this deviation, this gap, this écart, that constitutes the libertine. Libertine fiction thus breaks with all measure of plausibility and verisimilitude. And in a lecture posing the question, why did Sade write, Foucault puts it as follows: writing is that which excludes reality. Consequently, it is that which will free up, will remove every limit to the imaginary itself. Because of writing, we will have, to use Freudian vocabulary, a world entirely governed by the pleasure principle that will never have to encounter the reality principle. It's interesting that Foucault puts it that way. So writing is thus methodologically crucial, since it does not extend reality, extending its possibility, but serves to annihilate its constraint. The school of libertinage imagines the impossible. The imagination does not configure another reality, but takes its cue from its abolition. The truth of fiction lies in the negation of reality. Put differently, fiction contains a truth that reality lacks and that happens par aventure, by chance. Reality conforms to the likely, producing a fiction governed by normative constraint. Libertine fiction no longer receives its law from reality but desire. Imagination liberates reason from the reasonable. So like the fortress of Silling, whose roots of access and exit have been destroyed and whose doors have been walled shut, the story of libertinage barricades itself within the articulation of a movement of desire unhinged from restraint. As Durset argues, the happiness of the libertine does not lie in pleasure's satisfaction, even when conceived as the complete satisfaction of all the pleasures of the senses. And this is Durset. It's not in pleasure that happiness consists. It is in desire. It is in breaking the chains that hold back this desire. So this is a moment of a distinction between pleasure and desire. So positing the relation between crime and desire, horror and sex, the libertine apprehends that corruption, filth, does not belong to the object, but the desire it occasions. The corrupt object appears as such only in relation to the idea and not the object of corruption, for it is the idea of what is lacking in it that makes it corrupt. Quote, I am perfectly sure it is not the object of libertinage that drives us, but the idea of evil. That consequently it is for evil alone that we get hard and not for the object. So that if this object were stripped of the power to harm us, it would no longer make us hard. If it is indeed the idea and not the object of evil that solicits a libertine's desire, then only an immeasurable crime, an act beyond measure, promises the maximum of enjoyment. The libertine must confront a law of diminishing returns, since pleasure derives, or enjoyment derives not from the object, but from the idea of its negation. Only crimes that combine as much darkness and as much depravity as much deceit and betrayal as possible can produce a lubricious effect. The libertine comes face to face with the peculiar impossibility of their concern, forced to confront the fate of possessing an imagination that infinitely outstrips the means at the libertine's disposal. I'm going to quote a famous passage from 120 Days of Sodom. As for me, I confess that my imagination has always been in this respect beyond my means. I have always conceived 1,000 times more than I have carried out, and have always railed against nature, who in giving me the desire to offend her, always robbed me of the means to do so. There are no more than 2 or 3 crimes to commit in the world, said Clerval. Once those are done, there is no more to be said. What remains is inferior, and one no longer feels a thing. How many times, good God, have I not wished it were possible to attack the sun, to deprive the universe of it, or to use it to set the world ablaze? Those would be crimes indeed, and not the little excesses in which we indulge, which do no more than metamorphose in the course of a year a dozen creatures into clods of earth. So the imperative to imagine everything ends with the reduction of all to naught. Okay, so now I'm making the transition. If Sade's fiction turns on the imperative to imagine everything, to say all, making a heaven of hell, Beckett takes his departure from the fact that there's nothing left to say. The writer must abandon the hope of saying anything, and there is nothing to be done about it. One must be committed to a disintegration of all givens, not just the given prejudices of the imagination. So Sadean enlightenment is a dream of imagining without prejudice, we could say. So as Beckett puts it in the letter to Axel Kaun, formulating what he calls a literature of the non-word, Unwort, this is a matter of boring holes into language in the, quote, terrifyingly arbitrary materiality of the word surface. Beckett continues, "It is to be hoped the time will come, thank God, in some circles it already has, when language is best used where it is most efficiently abused. Since we cannot dismiss it all at once, at least we do not want to leave anything undone that may contribute to its disrepute. To drill one hole after another into it until that which lurks behind, be it something or nothing, starts seeping through. I cannot imagine a higher goal for today's writer." Nothing to say, nothing to be done. Saying nothing is a matter of turning on the instrument, and thus the mastery such techne implies. Beckett's imperative thus becomes, do not imagine one can say anything, do not imagine the worst, for this leaves space for hope of meaning's beneficence, right? So Beckett situates the art of making the worse the better in terms of what Shakespeare's Edgar from King Lear calls the lamentable change. So this is Edgar. Yet better thus, and known to be condemned, than still condemned and flattered. To be worst, the lowest and most dejected thing of fortune, stands still in esperance, lives not in fear. The lamentable change is from the best, the worst returns to laughter. Welcome then, thou unsubstantial air that I am. Welcome then, thou unsubstantial air that I embrace. The wretch that thou hast blown unto the worst owes nothing to thy blast. So whereas the worst can always be better, the worst returns to laughter, the best lives in fear of fortune's changing tides. The worst, the lowest and most dejected thing of fortune, is not the worst because it stands still in espérance, right? It stands still in hope. Yet for Beckett, to quote one of his condensed maxims of Nicolas Sebastien Roquechambord, hope is a knave, befools us evermore, which till I lost no happiness was mine. I strike from hell's to grave on heaven's door, all hope abandon ye who enter in. Framed in relation to the school of libertinage, the pleasure of always doing evil might in fact be best, but the best is not necessarily better when it comes to the worse. Evil retains its charm only if the worse is indeed the better. Never doing good, the essence of libertine constraint, becomes a matter of ill-saying, ill-seeing. Beckett compels the libertine to reason thusly. If the worse is indeed better, then the best, the highest good, is not better, for it is not worse. If the best is not better, then the worst which is best is also not better. The better is the worse. The art of making the worse the better consigns the libertine to a logic of worsening. The libertine seeks the unworsenable worst. However, in this demented logic, the worse is better than the best, because what is better than the best is worse than the worst. This might be von Witz, right? So this makes what is worse than the worst less than nothing. What is less than nothing is better than the good. And evil is not of necessity the worst. There's a thing, the unnameable, worse than the worst, and it can thus be better than the best, because it is less a matter of the worst than worsening. What is better than the best and worse than the worst is at once more than something and less than nothing. It is not hell that is heavenly, but hope of heaven that has become hellish. The hope of heaven in Beckett is not heavenly, nor are its surrogates, particularly the promise of homecoming. The only way of not being at home in hell is not to hope for heaven. To see hope as a thing truly homely and ugly. Beckett's work places itself under the imperative, don't hone after home. In an early note occasioned by his reading of Burton's Anatomy of Melancholy, Beckett pens the imperative, don't be honing after home. So honing is in longing after home. Home is a horror, as Beckett suggests in a letter to McGreevy, quote, the sensation of taking root like a polybus in place is horrible, right? Like a pustule, living on a kind of mucus of conformity. The mind is in league with one's nature or family's nature. It pops up and says, égal. So the promise of being at one with oneself, at home in nature, what Jacques Lacan terms the archaic form of the pastoral, is deadly for Beckett. In Dream of Fair to Middling Women, Beckett makes frequent, this is his first novel, Beckett makes frequent use of the contraction womb tomb to refer to Belacqua's honing after the pleasant, gracious, bountiful tunnel, which he remembers, but from which he is barred irreparably, and to which he can only gain entry at ultimate cost. He cannot get back, not for the life of him. This is a good example of Beckett's deadpan humor. The idiomatic phrase, not for the life of him, assumes a deadly literality. It is the life in him that bars access to the life he desires, which is no life at all. The desire to be done with life, to silence the mad crescendo of woe, to expunge his consciousness, is a desire for death in life, to die. To separate life from the meaning that imposes the demand of death. And writing in this context becomes a matter of learning how to die. And this is wagered at the level of the story. How am I doing for time, just out of curiosity? Fine, okay. So this is wagered at the level of the story. Already in Dream of Fair to Middling Women, so Beckett's first novel, he divorces writing from any belief in a rounded world. Beckett never felt the lure of monism. In Dream, this takes the form of an opposition, not simply between the subject and the object, but between the subject and itself. Belacqua will be doubled by the figure of Nemo, Latin for nobody, which Beckett describes as a symphonic, not a melodic unit. Whereas the melodic signifies a lovely Pythagorean chain chant of solo, of cause and effect, a one-figured telephony that would be a pleasure to hear. The symphonic unit is not a note at all, but the most regrettable simultaneity of notes. The symphonic has become noise, bearing only a nominal relation to music. Despite suggestiveness of the adjective, the symphonic is definitively not a symphony. It names the other of its name, a thing coming unstuck from what the name presumes to name. The name Balakwa presents us with a cubic unknown, but this empty place serves to locate a multiplicity, a series of terms that cannot be summed or defined. Quote, they tail off vaguely at both ends, and the intervals of their series are demented. The name is a cubic unknown insofar as it differentiates its name by opposing itself from what it names, the signified, the referent, etc. And as long as this difference can itself be measured, one can pass from 1 to 2 or 0.1 to 0.01 from one unit or note to the next. This passage presupposes a shared scale, a countable interval that delimits the passage between beginning and end. Yet the demented interval introduces a principle of incoherence, preventing any hope of synthesis other than nominal. This principle unbinds any account of character, of person, of the psychological identity suggested by the ego. It is thus crass, as Beckett puts it, to think that any character will do their dope, this is the language of Dream, or play their part. For they are composed of refractory constituents whose petrification, whose backwash into composure is a result of artificial immobilization. I have a nice passage here from that, but I'll skip over and maybe just read another one. So the contours of the ego are in perpetual erosion. This is how Beckett puts it. Comparing the face of the character Lucien to Rembrandt's portrait of his brother, Beckett writes, and this is kind of a brilliant passage, I think, his face surged forward at you, coming unstuck, coming to pieces, invading the airs, a red dehiscence of flesh and action. You warded it off. Jesus, you thought it wants to dissolve. Then the gestures, the horrid gestures of the little fat hands and the splendid words and the seaweed smile, all coiling and uncoiling and unfolding and flowering into nothingness. His whole person a stew of disruption and flux. And that from the fresh miracle of coherence that he presented every time he turned up. How he kept himself together is one of those mysteries. By right, he should have broken up into bits. He should have become a mist of dust in the airs. He was disintegrating bric-a-brac. So the subject incoheres, you might say it cleaves together, marking the place of an incommensurability between the nominal coherence of a name and the presentation of a disintegrating substance. Thus, little by little, Balakwa may be described, but not circumscribed. His terms stated, but not summed. And this is Beckett. And God's will be done should one description happen to cancel the next, or the terms appear crazily spaced. His will, never ours. So Beckett's first novel already installs the reader within an atomized cosmos, whose vast of void, right, to allude into the vast of void, to allude to the formulation of one of his last texts, Wordsworth Ho. So a character does not do his dope, which is to say, does not fall into line. Our line bulges every time he appears. Whereas most characters can be made to stand for something, Balakwa, precisely because he can smell the symphonic rat in our principal boy, stands for nothing. The line bulges with his present absence. So the name Balakwa does, of course, stand for something. Balakwa alludes to the Florentine lute maker whose lassitude so impressed Dante that he installed him in weary repose at the base of Mount Purgatory, bereft of motivation. He does not even have the desire to turn his gaze upwards towards the peak. When Dante in Canto 4 of the Purgatorio asks why does he not ascend, Balakwa replies, "Oh brother, what is the use in going?" Not seeing the point, he is Beckett's first instance of the nothing to be done, which will be made famous as Estragon's opening line in Waiting for Godot. To quote now Watt, if the only way one can speak of nothing is to speak of it as though it were something, Balakwa is something that stands for nothing and in a double sense. He stands for nothing in the sense that he is a sign of or substitute for the nothing, but he also stands for nothing insofar as he represents a peculiar refusal of standing his ground, taking a stand, remaining in place, refusing to move on. But, true to this persuasion, he immediately does so, right? So he actually doesn't stand for something, he stands for nothing by standing for the nothing. So by standing for nothing, he is utterly and completely indifferent since he does not stand for anything. Balakwa thus epitomizes nothing. Quote, yet various though he was, he epitomized nothing. He has nothing to stand for and therefore stands for nothing. As Beckett suggests in Watt, this betrayal is utterly galling. It presents the void by filling it, as a seam is formed in the act of being stitched. The defining event of the novel, Watt, concerns an incident at Mr. Knott's house, and it's Knott, Mr. Knott's house, which fails to make sense and which, despite Watt's considerable efforts, cannot be made sense of. It galls. This event involves a father and son duo of technicians, namely the Galls, Gall Sr. and Gall Jr., the master and the apprentice, who arrive with tranquil assurance of members of an ancient guild to tune Mr. Knott's piano. Their assessment is dire. I quote Watt. 9 dampers remain, said the younger, and an equal number of hammers. Not corresponding, I hope, said the elder. In one case, said the younger. The elder had nothing to say to this either. The piano is doomed, in my opinion, said the younger. The piano tuner also, said the elder. The pianist also, said the younger. This was perhaps the principal incident of Watt's early days in Mr. Knott's house. The Galls, despite their name, are not at all galled by the state of ruination in which they find the piano. On the contrary, the father seems concerned that the piano system seems to be intact. It is not enough that only 9 dampers and hammers remain of 88. The father hopes that none of the remaining dampers and hammers correspond to their respective strings. What is galling about the arrival of the Galls is their lack of gall. The art of making the worse the better is now indexed to an art that cannot be mastered, for it consists in worsening. A piano tuner only makes sense in a world in which pianos are given. The piano mediates the relation between pianist and piano tuner, a link between the ideal and the material. The technician is tasked with bringing the instrument in accord with an ideal note, an ideal whose impossibility sets the interval which the true master will attempt to exhaust. The master technicians allow the instrument to be an instrument, ensuring that its only materiality will not disturb or interrupt the pianist's efforts. If the instrument is doomed, this will doom in turn the tuner and the pianist. What is galling about the Galls is that they seem to embrace the lack of correspondence between the hammer and the string, embracing the piano's dysfunctionality, embracing in turn the loss of the sense of their mastery. This piano is all but destroyed, hanging on by a single string. This deeply embedded pun ensures the piano remains tethered by the faintest of threads, by a single chord, to its purpose, tethered to its purpose while rendering it impossible. This is a piano in all but name alone. It is nominal. The minimum of correspondence ensures that at least a horrific note can be struck, the doom chord. The Galls are attuned to the imperfection of the instrument, and by extension its relation to a discordant note. Not a piano. This piano, if played, dooms all involved. By maintaining a relation to what it is not, this piano founds a discord. To play this piano is to play this peculiar knot. The Galls have nothing, strictly speaking, to tune, but as Beckett carefully writes, they are not there to tune a piano, but to tune the piano. It's odd. Choon. So with this incident, Beckett attunes us, the reader, to language, to the difference between tuning and tuning, a difference in accent and inscription that marks an interval that can be seen, hardly heard, but signifies nothing. Tune marks the irrevocable caprice of its taking place, a pure accident of language attached to a pure plastic content that dissolves the meaning associated with tuning a piano into an event of great formal brilliance and indeterminable purport. What is formed as a plastic content is a thing that is nothing, not a piano tuned, but a piano tuned, a piano positioned in relation to what it is not. It is because the Gauls are untrue to their name, impossible to Gaul, that they relate to it, adjusting the piano skillfully to this absence. And Beckett writes, to elicit something from nothing requires a certain skill. They relate to a piano as foolish as it sounds, that can only produce a tune. As the pun installs discord at the crux of the logos, in the beginning was the pun, to quote Beckett's Murphy. This is a piano that bears only a negative relation to armonia, the Greek for harmony, armonia. It is keyed rather to what Neary and Murphy calls apmonia, formed by a grave error, a false transposition of the Greek letter rho with the letter P, with which it shares a figural, purely imaginary similarity. So the Gauls are concerned with what the piano is not, and thus with a piano that serves to make the pun present. Beckett stresses that this is not only the principal incident of Watt's early days in Mr. Knott's house, but that it resembles all incidents of note at Mr. Knott's. What troubles Watt in this incident is that he is unable to say, that is what happened then. The note to be noted cannot be properly struck. And this is a nice passage from Watt. What distressed Watt in this incident of the Gauls, father and son, and in subsequent similar incidents, was not so much that he did not know what had happened, for he did not care what had happened, as that nothing had happened, that a thing that was nothing had happened, with the utmost formal distinctness, and that it continued to happen. In his mind, he supposed, though he did not know exactly what that meant, and though it seemed to be outside him, before him, about him, and so on, inexorably to unroll its phases, beginning with the first, the knock that was not a knock, and ending with the last, the door closing that was not a door closing, and omitting none, uninvoked, at the most unexpected moments and the most inopportune. It, whatever it is, cannot be said because there is nothing to say, and can only be said because one can only form a relation to it, present it, by saying the nothing there is to be said. It can only be missaid. Now I'm really at my conclusion. The effort to say nothing undoes all those who attempt to meet its imperative. The passage from Sade to Beckett is thus a passage from the writing of horror to the horror of writing, the horror of language. The latter commits itself to what Beckett in Wordsworth Hode names the unknullable least. The school of libertinage must face the fact that the supreme effort to say all leaves a knot, N-O-U-G-T, right? So leaves a knot that can never be reduced to nothingness. To write the difference between not and nothing consigns the writer to a meaningless inscription that makes all the difference to the all, since it ensures that it is not all. And I'll end with a passage from Wordsworth Hoe. Worse less, by no stretch more, worse for want of better less best, no, not best, best worse, no, not best worse, not best worse, less best worse, no, least best worse, least never to be not be brought, never by not be nulled, unknullable least. Say that best worse, with leastening words, say least, best, worse, for want of worser, worst, unlessenable, least, best, worse. Okay, thanks.